Welcome to the first episode of the slideshow. I'm Dakota Jackson, play trombone in New Orleans. I just got my master's degree in jazz studies from New Orleans. As of right now, I'm just sitting here practicing though, thanks to COVID. And I'll be doing the show with my good friend Benjamin Wiltz.
Hi guys, I'm Benjamin Wiltz. I graduated with my bachelor's in music from University of Arkansas Monticello. Go Weevils! I attended Northwestern State University down in Natchitoches, Louisiana for a year before taking on the band directing position up here in Mammoth Spring, Arkansas. I am a bass trombone player, and I am just in love with everything about the trombone, its history, and everything to do with it. And I'm just really glad that I'm getting this opportunity with Cody to get to talk about trombone.
Yeah, which is it's basically what we're doing the podcast. We're just going to talk about different trombone subjects, from everything from gear to performers. Probably steer away from pedagogy a little bit, just because there's a lot of really qualified people out there putting stuff like that out. And I just want to clarify that we are not presenting ourselves as experts or everything we say is the law. I just mainly like both of us are doing this to learn more about the trombone ourselves, and hopefully you find something interesting or you find something that you can dig into on your own. And if you have any thoughts, let us know, because love ideas for the podcast as well as any information you may have found on whatever topic we're doing. We're going to try and do weekly episodes, which we'll probably release every Thursday. I don't know if we'll keep up a weekly thing after COVID, but definitely during quarantine. Talk about trombone and current events to start off with. There's a little reemergence of some Frank Rosolino stuff out there, which Paul Brewer found a rather old interview with Frank. It's about 50 minutes long. There's like a couple of excerpts of him playing some different stuff, which is pretty cool. He talks about some tunes. I learned quite a bit from it. And then I think Luke Melwitz put that up on YouTube, so I'll tag a link to that below this. And there's also a masterclass of his, which just reappeared at McGill University, which is also super cool. I listened to that one again myself. But both those are just out there. So
another event that happened. So as we all know, COVID-19 has impacted almost every portion of the economy and our lives in general. It has definitely impacted the music industry. And in the trombone family, we've had Ron Wilkins over in San Antonio. He was actually in ICU. He's a bass trombone player over there. And he was actually put in the ICU and was on a ventilator for a while. But he has been released from the ICU and apparently is doing much better. So that's a current event, and that might be some uplifting news.
Yeah, if you're not hip to Ron, definitely go check him out. He's super killing bass trombone, tenor trombone, vocals. He's been up in New York last couple of years, but he's from San Antonio. He went home during all this. But yeah, he's just an extremely musically gifted guy, and he's just got some freakish chop stuff, man. If you want to hear somebody who can buzz like no other, man, it's ridiculous. So our first topic, which I thought would be a good fitting topic we went over a couple different ones. So for the first one, it's just like the origin of the trombone, which is surprisingly juicy, just because there's not a lot of definitive answers. So there's going to be quite a bit of debate. But yeah, let me right away, if you don't want to listen to this whole thing to figure this out, let me just tell you, I can't pinpoint you a year, and I can give you some ideas, I can give you some contrasting opinions, but saying it was like 1472 by so-and-so is just not going to happen. So that's what we got right away. So the first thing is a lot of, when you look at the beginning, where it starts spreading immediately is nomenclature. You've got, the term trombone, the term poussin, and the term sackbut, which are still alive today. Sackbut is actually from the word sakor, which means to draw your sword. So that's kind of cool. That's just like the French believing. Um, and then and to to complicate matters further, there's like a group of people, a mindset that like the word sackbut shouldn't even exist because we'll not get into this deeper, but that the trombone hasn't evolved enough to not just be the trombone the whole time, but it's like sackbut is like a older model of the trombone, like a precursor to the trombone. Poussanen is German, or Poussin, and they've been calling it Poussin or something pretty close the whole time. Although I will find out pretty soon that that is also up for debate because there's a lot of mixture with that origin. And then trombone is a Italian. It's an Italian word which is the mixture of tromba and one. Tromba is like trumpet, one is like large. So large trombone is how you kind of get that word. And obviously that's what is used most everywhere now in America for sure. Um, but so like just right off the bat, I want to say that like a lot of my early sources, if you want to start digging into these yourself, was from Will Kimball, and I'll drop his stuff into the description below. But he teaches trombone at BYU. He's an excellent trombone player, and then he's just a master historian. If you go to his website, it's the most complete trombone history timeline I've ever seen. It's just a ridiculous amount of sources, and I'm sure Ben went there quite a bit himself. It's just a lot of information on his website.
Definitely did, man. It's a good place. Check it out.
So, as I said, the nomenclature kind of depends on the area. And so, when we're looking about where the trombone is from, the debate is either like southern France and Italy or Germany. And and so you find people who either say it's definitely from southern France, Italy, or it's from Germany. And then you'll find people who don't want to want to pick a side, so they'll say like Western Europe or something, which is, I guess, accurate, just not very, not very decision making. But I found through my research that I kind of think that everybody's correct because of this. I think that the first trombone that we see, and a couple different sources kind of said that this was what they thought happened, is that the court of Burgundy wanted trombone players, and so they have the first trombone players, which is falls in line with the logic because a lot of people who say southern France or Italy are going off the basis of a player rather than a maker. And if you're going off the maker, you say Germany, because at this time, like the most prevalent instrument makers in the world were Flemish makers, which Flemish is like an older word for Dutch. So German makers. And if you're looking at like Luxembourg, which is on the tip of Germany, that's where all these Flemish makers were. So I think what probably happened is if you look at the control of the Burgundies at this time, believe it or not, it encompasses southern France, Italy, and then like Luxembourg, like the tip of Germany. So this was actually like probably all like one area realistically at the time. Um, so what probably happened was like these Flemish makers made this trombone, and then they brought them to the court of Burgundy to be played. Um, so I mean, so I don't know if that settles the debate or only enrages people. But yeah, I personally think that actually the debate's not even really a debate. I think it's probably everyone's correct. I don't know. Like, did you find anything on that, Ben? Like, have you stuck to one answer when people have asked you?
So I definitely copped out. As I was looking, I did notice the consistent thing was that, yeah, the instruments were definitely being made more towards Germany, and that had to do a lot with metalwork. It wasn't just instruments being made in Germany, but Germany just seemed to have a hand on craftsmanship a lot more at the time. So I was seeing a lot more of that. But yeah, we'd start to see players coming out of France, and so it's really tough to see. And we don't know. Also, these are just things that survived. So we really don't know what was going on at the time. I mean, paperwork definitely gets lost. You guys will see as we go through this. A lot of times, it could be as something simple as an invoice for somebody hiring a player, is where we get some of these sources as to where people are coming from. So, Western Europe is kind of what I was going from there, because I really could not pin it down to just one place, which I think that's fair. And the nomenclature definitely muddies the water some too, because like in Italy, the trombone was named for quite a while. But we know for a fact that the first use of the trombone in Italy was to describe a large trumpet and not what we know of as the trombone. So I, I could see where it can be confusing. And I do think that, yeah, it's safe to say that it definitely evolved in that area, but to pinpoint which one would be a hard sell.
Yeah, man. I mean, you can definitely look up Flemish makers. You can look up the Cor Burgundy. But yeah, I think what like the first thing we run into over and over again is just like that. It's hard to tell when people were talking about big trumpets or trombones. And I just wanted to add before we keep going that the I was looking at Will Kimball's site and the sources he used saying that it was from Germany was this guy Trevor Herbert, who was published by Yale, and then the Southern France Italy people were published by was a guy named Robert Eliasson, and he was published by Harvard. So it's a good old Yale Harvard debate right there, right away. If you go to Harvard, you now have to believe Southern France Italy. And if you go to Yale, you have to believe Germany. So I thought that was fun. Also, just a completely random side note, but I can't let this go because I don't know how long I'm gonna remember this. I was looking at the Yale book, and I saw Big Chief Robert Moore. And if you're not hip to this guy, I've like never seen a picture of him before. You should just go look up a picture real quick because the dude plays out of like the very corner of his mouth. It's absolutely absurd. He was a Native American from Arizona, and he played with Louis Armstrong for a little bit. But it's I mean a wild guy. Definitely go find a picture of this guy. All right, so going back into like the earliest dates we have, I just started going with the first terms we get that people say that maybe that this is a trombone in 1403. This is the earliest one. I don't really think that this is a trombone, but I don't potentially depending on what you want to go on, and we'll get more into this later with some photographic evidence, not photographic pictures. In 1403, there's a bassooner on a sticker on a city records of payment. So bassooner kind of meaning like a larger trumpet, and people think this could have been a trombone. I don't think so. It seems really early to some of the other dates, but like this could potentially be the very first one in 1403. A couple years later, in 1407, you have tuba grossa, which is Latin for large trumpet. So once again, it's just at what point this large trumpet comes into play. Uh, Between 1414 and 1418, uh, there's the term bassoonin, which we know refers to a single slide trumpet. So once again, and this is also going to go into like what do you what do you call a trombone? At what point is it a trombone versus some kind of slide trumpet? Like another confusing thing is that we know for sure that like originally Poussin actually just meant trumpet, and that word just kind of merged into trombone. So with the German, it's extremely difficult to tell when that started meaning trombone. It's just super muddy. In 1418, there's Trompeta por Minister. I'm sorry if I mispronounced. If you're like German and listening to this or something, like I by no means claim to be fluent in German or pronounce any of this correctly. So I mean, feel free to comment like, this is outrageous. Be my guest. It just means war trumpet, which I guess some people thought might have been the first sign of a trombone. I'm not sure why they would think that with the word war trumpet. I mean, no, personally, I know that trumpets have been used for a long time to like bring people into battle, and that never meant trombone. But you get that. In 1439, you have tromba. Oh, so start seeing the like in Italy, you start seeing the original trombone terms. So in 1439, you have tromba and then one, which together is trombone. One means large, tromba means trumpet. 1444, we have tube tortusa or something. Was it tortose? Tortose? Once again, I have no no idea. The tortosa doesn't actually mean slow or anything. It means that it had curves at this point, like a repeatedly twisted trumpet. Um, and then I pointed out here in 1446, we have a payment to a guy by the name of Jan de Bracht, and I don't know. Either this guy played like a low trumpet, or potentially this is like the first known trombone player. I mean, that would be pretty sick. It's just, once again, it's impossible to tell what he actually played. Um, but and then I put in here also in 1447 we have the term trombone de argento, which means silver trombone. Uh, so for me, like, and I think Ben's going to disagree with me a little bit here, but I think by 1447 we had trombones. And the reason I say that is because, like, it seems weird to me that there would be like a somewhat agreed upon trombone term, and that they would start building silver trombones or have the clarification of a silver trombone. But I don't know, man. Like, we'll get into the pictures here in a second, because I think this brings a lot of division. Because you find a lot of people who think that the trombone started around 1488, and that's because of a chapel. But what I just that's as far as I'm going to go into just listing off these dates or whatever. So I think in my opinion, by 1447, some iteration of the trombone existed. But I think Ben's going to have a later date.
Yeah, so I definitely went with the later date, mostly because rather than fight with the crowd of people who are trying to say what might be a trombone or what might be a trombone. I think if you look at the fresco on, I believe, let me see what chapel it's on, but the title of the fresco is the Assumption of the Virgin.
The Carafa Chapel, I think, is the if you're looking at the chapel in Italy.
Yeah, Filippino Lippi's fresco, the Assumption of the Virgin. It does depict a trombone as we would recognize it today. And the reason I would start there is because, to be honest, like, we really just have, without any concrete evidence. I mean, we don't have any surviving instruments before this day, so we have pictures to go off of, because because just what they were saying was a trombone or a large trumpet was so confusing. I just was playing it safe and said, for sure, by 1488 there were trombones. Now we know that could have been way earlier too, if they depicted it. But I like to think of it as, by 1488, trombones were here, and they were used in a manner which we would recognize today as a trombone.
Yeah, so let's just pull up these pictures here, like the earliest pictures of possible trombones. And this is on Will Kimball's timeline, so if you want to like check this out, just go back to the earliest part of his timeline. It'll pop up real fast. So we've got this guy here in 1465. It's a picture in France, and once again, you'll have to forgive me because I don't speak French, but it's La Danse aux Avilages, something like that. Includes what possibly is a trombone. We don't know the original who made this. Yeah,
I saw that one. So I've seen that one, and that one's close, man. I got to be honest. That one to me could be a trombone, but it could easily be something else too. So that's part of the reason why I'm skeptical, but I'm open to the idea.
Yeah. One thing with this one I'll point out is there's like what looks like little X's holding the trombone together. And that's not too crazy. At the time, they were making instruments and they were binding them together with leather. Like metal instruments, they were binding together with leather. So that's not too nuts. There's also like a weird little upwards bell thing going on here. Kind of like a Dizzy Gillespie. Wayne Henderson, if you're hip to that. I mean, it's I don't know, man. If this is a trombone, I would like us to call it a trombone and clarify down so that we could say that it happened before Dizzy, that this was a trombone thing. And that also, man, my favorite part of this picture, if you don't go check it out, is that he's like he's like on stage. For some reason, the queen's blindfolded. I'm sure there's some context here, but everyone's dancing or whatever, and he's clearly providing the music, and he's just mean mugging it. Like this must have just been the worst gig, man. It looks like this cat is getting underpaid.
Severely.
And so, okay, moving forward, the next picture we have is 1474, once again in Italy. Oh, the last one was in France. This one's in Italy. Man, I hate even trying. This is the Assumption of the Virgin. This is a sitter panel at the altarpiece in Saint Agostino. She's pretty insignificant. It's like a little angel playing the trombone. If you look at the overall picture, it looks like this is Mother Mary in the middle. But she's kind of like off to the side here. One thing with this picture is that, like, the big thing with this is that there's a slide for sure, but you can't see a bell in this picture.
In the Assumption?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess, I don't know if we were looking at the same picture. 1488 is what I have, the Assumption of the Virgin.
Yeah, 1488
by Lippi.
1488 is the Carafa Chapel, which is a different picture. That's not the Assumption of the Virgin. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. The Assumption of the Virgin is in 1474, and there's no bell.
Alrighty. So interesting. So to clarify for everybody who's not listening, or everybody who is listening, we just had a mix-up. We decided to not show each other's research, or show each other's research to each other, and obviously with the prevalence of the Catholic Church, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary was a very commonly depicted thing, and there are actually multiple depictions of it, as the Carafa Chapel is also titled the Assumption of the Virgin as well.
Well, there you go.
As I'm looking at it. And so, yeah, this is my first time seeing this one on 1474. But yeah, with no bell being present, and we don't have moving pictures, I do not believe gifts were around at the time. It is tough to say how this was played, but it could be. I mean, I like to think of it as closer to what might be considered a Renaissance slide trumpet. But I think that's why we should leave these pictures in the description, so you guys can kind of make your own decisions there.
Okay, so going to the definitive picture here in 1488. So this one is it's also called, this one is like on a cathedral like ceiling. This one is obviously a trombone player. There's no doubt about this one. I'll also
we are in fourth position.
Yeah, I'll also say that you can like go later and find trombone players who like don't, like, I don't know, like, it's just like there was not agreed upon what was going on with the slide and everything, so they're like holding it or like weird or whatever. But this guy is like holding the trombone correctly in this painting of this angel's holding it correctly in 1488. He's even got it popped out like Bob McChesney or something. That's
this is significantly better than things you see at like a J.C. Penney catalog or something like that. This is proper trombone technique.
Indeed. If you look at the overall picture, some of this is like worn down over the years, but he's off to the left above some other weird looking instruments here, and I haven't really spent a lot of time looking at this overall picture, but this angel's like floating around playing for what I'm going to assume is Mary in the middle. It's kind of tough to tell with the image I got here, but
absolutely is Mary being ascending into heaven. That is part of liturgy. So
yeah. So to summarize, to give everything a round answer that you could say and be completely in the clear, the trombone is like definitely from Western Europe. You can say that you have the area mapped out. It's definitely from Germany, southern France, Italy, and by 1488 for sure they had trombones. Um, Before that, it's like sketchy. I mean, you start talking about like you know I don't know if you've seen original trumpets, but without valves, they just pop out the slide at the end and then change them out. And it's very likely that some of the earlier terms we found were just really large versions of those. So
Yeah, man. Definitely, definitely like some of the things I heard on there, man. And the 1474, I have actually not seen that picture at all. So I am glad you showed that to me, so I can look at that some more. I'm really curious on how that instrument played without a bell, and I wonder if there's any surviving ones.
well, that's another thing, man. I think even later, surprisingly later, we start to see like there's trombones that the bell's pointing out behind them. And so, I mean, potentially that could be what's happening in the pictures. There is a bell, we just can't see it. She is kind of crowded. I don't know. I hesitate to think that. I mean, another thing I was thinking about the entire time I was looking at these older pictures was like how badly trombone is represented in commercials or anything like that. I mean, man, I've seen some. You can find a Macy's ad if you go look for it where the guy's playing the trombone upside down. I mean, they just let that get through. So like I don't know, man. I mean, painters probably had a little bit more pride back in the day, but he literally could have been like, "This looks like an instrument," and just drawn something. I would not be surprised, or for that matter, had a real trombone and just not drawn a bell. I mean, that's completely possible too. There's no way. I mean, I don't know, man. That was the that was the
Well,
marketing of the.
imagine being a Spanish artist or something, travel over to Italy, and you see these trombones for the first time, and then you go back to Spain, and then you're like, oh crap, I've got to draw one of these things. What that look like again? You just kind of throw a couple turns, and then say, yeah, his hand was somewhere out there, and then call it good.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
I mean, I would challenge if you're listening to this right now and thinking about it. I would just challenge you to draw a trombone, uh, just freehand it, and then ask yourself if you showed that to someone how accurately you have depicted the trombone, knowing that you've seen a bunch of them. Let alone this is a new concept.
speaking of, so do you have any do you have anything on early surviving trombones? Have you found like the first trombone that we found that we can put our hands on?
Oh, I don't have anything.
So Erasmus Schnitzer, over in Nuremberg, of course, Germany, he built trombones and other instruments, and the earliest trombone that we could find is actually dated 1551. And what I find interesting about this is, while they really only have one complete instrument to this date, we do have pieces and tubing, and these instruments varied in bore size somewhere between 400 to straight up 400 to 450 to 490, all in the same batch. So there were even so back then they had very inconsistent instrument manufacturing, and they really got the measurements of about 22 of them, and they found there's a huge like change of thickness from one instrument to the other when it comes to materials they use. So there's just a massive variety. And at the time, they didn't have stockings. I don't know if you've done anything like that, but trombone players would know that we have stockings at the end of our slides that helps keep a good seal. They didn't have stockings, and I guess to take out your spit, you had to just take the slide off. But no, so 1551 is the first trombone or is the oldest trombone right now that we could find that you could actually go look at. I did not find the museum that is currently being held at, but I also just did a little bit of reading recently.
Yeah, I was gonna say, another reason for the debate between whether or not sackbut is even a term is, if you're German, you've called it a Poussin the entire time. When it was in the sackbut stage, they called it a Poussin. And so, like in America, it's like sackbut's the older trombone, and then there's trombone. That's not a thing necessarily everywhere. And I will say that when I was at University of Arkansas Little Rock completing my degree, I got to play on a sackbut that was a supposedly an exact replica of one in the museum, and luckily it was in B flat. And uh, I'm not saying it blows exactly the same as a trombone, but I was able to play it. I could play an excerpt on it, for example, um, which I think is a lot more than you can say for some other instruments. I think if you look at some older versions of other instruments and told people who play them now to play them, I think they would struggle. So I and that in terms of that, like looking at the development, I personally don't feel like there's been enough development to say that it wasn't even a trombone, that it was something else. Uh, I mean, it really comes down to largening of the instrument. And obviously, a huge one is bell flare. If you look at early sackbuts, there's just basically, if you've seen a two-piece bell where you take the screw bell off and you have the little initial piece there, that's pretty much what a sackbut looks like. And I just that to me is not enough to call it a different instrument. But there is things you can look at if you do want to make that distinction.
This is something that I find repeated all the time when it comes to the sackbut, but even by people who aren't necessarily trombone players. I guess they think it's cool that they know the word sackbut. But I definitely agree. I mean, we don't call a Baroque flute anything different than what it is. It's still a flute, even though they were made of wood. And they definitely had some differences. They had holes instead of keys. But for some reason, when we go to trombone, it is very common to just refer to it as a sackbut rather than, why not call it a Renaissance era trombone like we'd call any other instrument. I think that adding sackbut to it, I think that causes some confusion, especially if you were to say, well, look at the sackbut from Germany, when they definitely have been calling it the same name for the whole time. And so I think the sackbut was partially a result of Britain. So I was looking into the history of the term sackbut, and in Britain, they thought they had an entirely new instrument when they saw references to French sackbuts and like called double trumpets that were called for, and eventually they found out that it was that it meant trombone. And along with some bad translations of the Bible, they thought that trombones were all the way back in Bible's times in the book of Daniel, because the word sackbut was used there. So I think whenever we add words like sackbut or we try to change the name of an instrument like that, I think it adds confusion whenever a lot of other instruments have a more cohesive history because they use the same name throughout. So maybe if you want to say posaune, whatever. Either way, I think using the term sackbut as an independent instrument of the trombone is just, to me, a little bit pedantic.
Yeah, I agree. I also feel like in like American culture, one of the reasons sackbut's still around is because people think it's hilarious to say, which is funny,
It absolutely is.
now knowing it means to like it comes from sackor to draw your sword, which is kind of cool, but it just sounds kind of cool. All right, welcome back to the slideshow. All right, what you got for us, Ben?
All right, so I'm going to talk about the early uses of the trombone. So prior to doing some of this research for this first episode of the podcast, all my teachers, which I've always had good teachers, and people around me I have always assumed that the trombone had its place or got its start in sacred music. But a lot of times, especially in the very beginning of the trombone, it was used in secular music. Now, in England, we get our first paid trombonist in 1495. We have proof that this guy was paid, but regular wages were not paid to players till much later. The first recorded use by trombone in English authority occurs in 1526. They sanctioned the purchase of an instrument And then in Spain, trumpets, shawms, and trombones were used to play at the baptism of Prince Juan. So now we see a little bit of sacred music now, especially once we get into the 16th century. Trombones by this point were given regular employment at churches. They were one of the most prominent professional instruments over in Spain during the 16th and 17th centuries, which I never thought of trombone having a large Spanish background. So I found this pretty interesting because, man, they really don't get a lot of love from the trombone world. But apparently, Spain was really producing a lot of players at the time, and they were paying their trombone players. So I thought that was pretty neat. Something else I was seeing too. So we started to see groups of trombonists. Something like we might even consider a trombone choir. Playing like in towns. We'd have church ensembles. Trombone might actually be one of the first instruments that we see to have these types of homogeneous ensembles too. This is all the way back to 1600s. So we don't have very much trombone choir music from this time, but we can assume that they played a lot of vocal music. And for the most part, it was either homophonic or it was usually even monophonic if it wasn't homophonic. So we don't see a lot of what we would recognize as our trombone choir music today, but we can assume that trombone choir got its start at least by the 1500s from what I'm reading right here, seeing, like I said, groups of 12 trombonists being paid at a time. So I thought that was pretty neat. I'm a big trombone choir fan. Cody, I know you were in a trombone choir for quite some time with me. And it's just pretty inspiring to see that we have evidence of trombone choirs before we have flute ensembles and which I guess flute is reaching because it's an old instrument, but trumpet choirs for sure.
I am a big fan of trombone choir, which if I could if I could play trombone choir music for a living, I definitely would, man. But it's a little harder. It's good to know that at one point in Spain, 12 guys were getting paid at a whop. But like one of the reasons I think it lends itself to like being such a good choir instrument is it's like mainly male vocal range, possibly going a little higher, a little lower. So it's already mimicking a normal, like a voice choir. So yeah, like a lot of the very first stuff I found was with shams. Sham ensembles would play with like for churches, but they would not play in the actual service. Like they could play for when they have guests or afterwards, like recessions, but they never played in the actual service. And this is because, like really early on, there was a big distinction between what was like loud music and soft music was a big thing, and soft was like generally considered voice stuff, and like this was like an earlier barrier. Like that's why the shams and the trombones were playing together, is because they were loud versus the soft stuff. Which is funny because, like I said, the trombone I feel like is just a huge mimicker of a male voice. So it's for me, I thought it was really weird to find that it was like immediately separated from the voice right away because it was too loud.
Yeah, I believe most trombone players who would listen to this podcast could probably relate once or twice. Me, especially as a bass trombone player, for some reason we often get stereotyped as being aggressive players, but this has been a problem throughout the trombone's history.
The dreaded hand.
Yeah. not to go too far in the future, but an author named Algernon Rose, if I pronounce that wrong, please somebody correct us. He wrote a book called Talks with Bandsmen in 1895. He says trombonists' propensity for playing too loudly was the reason one conductor in about 1850 employed trombones designed with the bell pointing back over the shoulder. This over-the-shoulder trombone was also used in at least one American band, Boston Brass Band, to match the design of other instruments, which were all over-the-shoulder models. So that is I guess maybe it's encouraging that all trombonists have went through the same struggle. I'm glad that we don't play over the shoulder. I will say that.
Yeah.
All right. To go back to the trombone's use, though. So we start to see the trombone. We start to see the trombone make its way into the churches, and then right now I have 1620, but there could we're constantly finding new music. So Cody, you might be able to correct me here. But in 1620, something magical happens, and we get our first solo trombone piece. Well, La Hieronyma was written by G.M. Cesar, who was a trombonist. Of course, a trombonist is going to have to commission and write trombone pieces because nothing has changed in 400 years. But he and then we had, so he wrote La Hieronyma. You can actually find recordings of trombonists playing La Hieronyma. I highly suggest that you look this up if you need to spell it. It is LA space HIERONYMA. There's plenty of YouTube videos for that. It's just really interesting to me to think that we can hear a piece of our instrument's history that far back. It is not at all what I expected. And then Francesco Ragnoni Taeggio, he included the trombone in a book of divisions to be played with a violin. So we start to see the trombone make some pushes towards solos, and then out of nowhere, towards the end of the 17th century, the trombone stopped being used, or stopped being used commonly. Part of the reason for this decline, people believe, has to do with the fact that string instruments were starting to be used more, especially more homogeneous string instruments. So rather than we have a mix of shawm, double reed, clashing with a stringed instrument, clashing with a brass instrument, people realized, hey, these instruments sound good together, and I like how this works. So we started to see high and low string instruments playing together and high and low brass instruments playing together versus a lot of mixing. So we're still experimenting with orchestration at the time. And unfortunately, the trombone got the short end of the stick and fell out of favor for a while. Then we see in the around 1750, so end of the Baroque era, the trombone makes it through the Renaissance era. Everything seems to be well for it. And then the Baroque era, it falls off for a little bit. We do have some, it does see some use, notably some solo works. Like I said, La Hieronyma, Wagenseil for the alto trombone, set after the Baroque era, get into the classical era, and the trombone is used heavily in churches. Cody was talking about the separation from the voice. The trombone goes from being separated from the voice to being stapled with the voice. A lot of times in music that the trombone wasn't even necessarily called for in, it was doubling voices. We have trio of trombones, alto, tenor, and bass. Alto was normally an E flat, the tenor was normally in B flat, and the bass was actually an F. So the bass was similar to what we would consider a contrabass today, but we did not have valves at the time. But all of these would be doubling the voices. So, for example, in Mozart's Coronation Mass, it actually has it actually does have a written trombone part. It has written trombone part, but for the most part, even in Mozart's masses, we see the trombones were just copying the voices completely. Some orchestras would seat the trombones among the choir, and some do that to this day. So we really start to see that the trombone is getting this association with the church, and it is very hard for the trombone to shake that association. It's not till Mozart starts using it in his operas that we start to see the trombone coming back to secular use. Even then, in his operas, like Don Giovanni, it's not until we have hell being depicted, or that the trombone is brought out. I like to say that the trombone at the time was used either to escort you to the afterlife or it means you've arrived. But for the most part, at the time, secular music, that's what the trombone was used for. I mean, it just was. And then we have Mozart's Requiem, where we have a very famous trombone solo in the tuba mirum of the Requiem. Now, a lot of sources, I was trying my best to look for trombone's first uses in secular music where it wasn't associated with the afterlife, and I think that falls on Beethoven. Now, this is where I remind you guys that I am no expert. But from everything I was seeing, I could not find very much trombone use in orchestra, at least, outside of Mozart's operas, where it was still depicting something supernatural, that the trombone was used in secular music at the time. And so I think Beethoven's third symphony, Eroica, is where we start to see the trombone being used. And actually the fifth symphony, it is heavily used. So by that point, Beethoven really decides he likes the trombone. And he really pushes the symphony and the orchestra to grow bigger. And we see the brass sections of orchestras expanding. And we get into the fun part, the Romantic era. This is where the trombone really, really shines. As brass sections are to their full potential at this point, we start seeing 3 trombones. Still to this point in Germany, we were seeing alto, tenor, and bass. But something I found interesting was Berlioz. I didn't know this, and I even have played plenty of Berlioz excerpts on my bass trombone. But Berlioz used a 3 tenor, or a 3 straight tenor section. So we see some variance in what these countries are doing. France had this, by the time we get to the Romantic era, France had this trombone section of 3 tenors, straight tenors. Germany was using this trio of alto, tenor, bass for the most part. And then Italy was moving to the adoption of valves as valve trombones were coming to be.
I was gonna say, like, I actually have a lot of juicy information on this particularly. First, I just want to say, like, I just want to throw major props to Germany, man. Like when I was doing this drop off thing, I found that, like, it kind of the trombone disappeared from Italy around 1630, and then England was kind of doing it till about 1680, and then that big gap there where there's almost no trombone. The only place where you could really hear trombone was alto trombone in Germany. So, you know, and this goes back to them possibly building it or whatever. I think there's been a real preservation of the trombone in Germany, and I'm just saying I'm thankful for Germany right now. I mean, I don't know if without Germany where we'd be at, you know. And then as far as you were saying with the different setups, I did find that there was a initial divide whenever the valves started happening between Germany and Italy, and the reason is that initial valves, and this is the least surprising thing I've ever heard, just were very clunky and did not sound that great or were hard to maneuver, which is just super unsurprising. And Germans, they tried it and they just didn't want to mess with it. I mean, it was just like why? It just sounds better to play a normal straight trombone, and then the Italians embraced it.
Thankful for the Germans again.
Yeah, exactly, man. And another thing is that you were talking about the different setups with composers just using like this 1 tenor trombone for their whole section. I found some really crazy information. All right, so Weber, which, if you're not familiar with Weber, by the way, writes incredible music for the trombone. But Weber and some other Brahms and Strauss, as well as some other people, were one of the things that they started doing initially was if they wanted alto trombone, rather than put an alto trombone in there, they would suggest using a smaller mouthpiece.
and then for bass trombone, a larger mouthpiece. I find I just knowing what we know now about the trombone, that is just wild. I mean, people switch to smaller mouthpieces for like, if they're gonna play like bolero, um, but like like Joe Alessi plays in like a huge mouthpiece for a tenor guy. A lot of guys do, and it doesn't necessarily make them sound like a bass trombone player. So it's just funny to think like, and rather than switch to a different trombone, they just thought put a different sized mouthpiece in, and that'll just substitute it. This was like this possibly could have just happened. I mean, I think that like with those, especially some bigger composers doing it, that could have like killed alto and bass trombone potentially. So, which is absurd. I do not think that small mouthpieces are a substitute for the alto trombone. I don't think that Dave Steinmeier sounds like an alto trombonist, but that's just me. So yeah, I just thought that was crazy too, man. You're talking about like people using, instead of like switch like the different setups of the trombones. I think one of the reasons with the three tenors or whatever was because of that mouthpiece idea of just switching size.
But then we see the trombone though used to its fullest. We are talking about that in the Romantic era, and I'm going to go out and just say this: I'm a massive Wagner fan, so I believe in being able to separate the artist from anything that he's done. So there is some controversy around Wagner, but I will say that I'm a big fan of, especially of what his writing he did for trombones. Wagner, whenever he wrote for the trombone, though, what I loved to see about it was that he wrote for, whenever he wrote his brass parts, he separated the trombones from the tuba section. So he had an instrument made for him called the Wagner tuba, which was impressive in itself. But the trombones, he would have a section of 3 tenor bass trombones, or what we would call a tenor trombone nowadays with an F attachment, and a contrabass trombone. And what I thought was neat about this though was the fact that like now we're starting to see this music where the trombone is acting, I'm going to say it's reaching like its full potential. We dialed things back since Wagner. It got expensive to pay orchestras this much money. So I really love seeing though that the limits were pushed so hard in the Romantic era, and we started to see that. But I don't know. I was really, once we get to the Romantic era though, I mean, most trombonists are familiar with what we're seeing there. We start to see solo pieces still coming up. We start to see more common solo pieces coming up. We have help me out here, Cody. August Bruns played the.
Oh yeah, he played the David concerto.
The David concerto. Yeah. So we start to see some Romantic era solos pop up that stick to the repertoire that are played to this day commonly, and this is really where trombonists still make their money. Is Romantic era music, at least in the orchestral side of things.
And this is the pivoting point that the trombone takes towards the modern trombone that we see today. And I believe this is where we're going to wrap up. We could spend a lot of time on this topic, but we value your guys' time and we appreciate everything y'all do.
Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. And this is kind of how our episodes are going to be, pretty laid back like this, but digging into some trombone rabbit holes. I mean, this is what me and Ben normally do when we talk on the phone. So all we're doing now is recording it so you guys can, share your thoughts and dig on your own. We're going to do a weekly album recommendation. And this week, our first album is called Four of a Kind, which is like a classic album as far as, classical trombone quartets go. Some really big names. Joe Alessi, who needs no introduction, the New York Phil, incredible soloist, Juilliard. Mark Lawrence, who now teaches at Colburn and used to be the principal at the San Francisco Symphony. He was at the time of the recording. Scott Hartman, who teaches at Yale and has done a number of really prestigious groups, including the brass band at Battle Creek. And then Blair Bollinger, who is the bass trombonist of the Philadelphia Orchestra and teaches at the Curtis Institute. So I highly recommend checking this out. I've played some of this music in trombone groups, and it really is trombone at the highest level, and it's just really impressive.
Cody, do you have a place where people might be able to find that album? Because some people might have trouble finding it.
Well, I know for sure that it's on Spotify. And
Well, for the Apple Music people, I will say that the second For the Kind album is on there, but not the first. So
so
if you were looking,
I'm sorry, man. The first album is on YouTube.
well, good stuff, man. I sure appreciate, like I said, anybody for tuning in. Please feel free to give us some feedback. Cody, I appreciate all the time you've put into making this happen. I've been so excited to really get to dig into some trombone specific stuff. And like I said, thank you again, man. Any last words?
I just want to thank everybody for listening, and keep practicing.